welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service Al Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasoliti, president of Al Monitor, and our guest this week is Gilles Kepel, professor and director of the Middle East and Mediterranean program at the Institute of Political Studies Paris, known as Sciences Po. Gilles is one of the leading authors and experts on the Arab and Islamic world, and he is also the host of the Al Monitor video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Kepel. Gilles and I will be discussing the visit of French President Emmanuel Macron to the Gulf earlier this month, the impact and expected consequences of the trip for France, the region, and for U.S. policy, and what we can expect from Gilles' upcoming podcast interview with Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi, founder of the Sharjah-based Barjeel Art Foundation. My conversation with Gilles Kepel, who accompanied Macron on his visit to the region, begins now. Gilles, welcome back to On the Middle East. You are our first three-time guest on the show.
I'm honored.
Gilles, you had a front row seat traveling with French President Macron to the Gulf earlier this month, and you've written about it with Le Grand Continent for our French readers out there. Let's do a scene setter to start. How do you explain and assess President Macron's approach to the Middle East? How's it received in Europe, and do you see it as a compliment or a challenge to U.S. influence in the region?
Well, Andrew, it's both a compliment and a challenge to U.S. influence, U.S. influence, which is to some extent perceived as waning by some of the rulers of the Middle East today after the Kabul pullouts. And of course, there is an opportunity to relaunch a closer dialogue with France, because France is the only other Western military power. Even if it's much smaller than the US, this necessarily, but one of the highlights of the trip was that in Dubai, Macron signed a contract for the acquisition of 80 Rafale fighter bombers from Dassault, while the UAE is still awaiting the conclusion of the negotiations of the F-35. So this in the context of the tensions in the region. Also, Macron went to Dubai first, then Doha, and finally Jeddah. And in a way, the presidential Airbus sort of linked together cities that had been totally separated only a year before. I mean, Qatar was under a blocus. You could not go from Abu Dhabi to Doha, from Doha to Jeddah. And in a way, it was the first trip of a Western leader that took into mind the fact that there was this massive reconciliation within the Gulf Cooperation Council. And after Macron left, actually, Mohammad bin Salman made his tour of the GCC, going to Oman, then Abu Dhabi, then Doha, and then Bahrain and Kuwait. So this was, not only something that had to do with U.S., European diverging views of our relations with the Middle East, which is the Near East for us to some extent, more than the Middle East, and because it's on our shores. But it also took place into this major reshuffling that takes place now after the Abraham agreements. And France, under Macron, wants to play the role of a stabilizing force in an area which is fraught with so many conflicts.
Let's start with the UAE, and you mentioned that the first stop on the trip was Dubai, and get into a little more detail on the arms sale, $18 billion warplane sale to the UAE. the largest ever French weapons contract for export. Now, the UAE was quick to say that this deal is a complement, not a replacement, for the pending US F-35 purchase, which is on a steady, if sometimes bumpy track here in Washington, given the opposition of some members of Congress to the arms sale, but it seems like it's going to go through. Was there some payback here with regard to France and toward the United States following the collapse of the $66 billion contract that France had with Australia to buy 12 French nuclear submarines? That the U.S. had kind of pulled the rug out under that contract as part of its new approach to its relationship with Australia and its military posture in Asia.
Well, I don't think it was that much of a tit for tat because, you know, the contract had been under negotiation for so long. But let's say that it was a good opportunity to show the U.S. that you know, they cannot just treat their allies, their longest allies, like crap, probably. But this was the sort of the global understatement. But the contract was, of course, much older than that. And you know, on the day after the agreement was signed, there was a statement from Tehran saying that France was destabilizing the region because it was selling warplanes, and definitely Iran felt that the UAE warplanes could be used as a deterrence to Iranian influence. And this took place in a very complex process of, you know, negotiations and weaponry building, because the day after, Sheikh Tahnoun, who is Mohammed bin Zayed's brother and his national security advisor, had visited Tehran, so his counterpart Alim Shamkhani. Then the week before, Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE, had visited Turkey with a $10 billion check to build up an investment fund there, and also, or most probably, to buy a handful of Bayraktar TB2 drones from Turkey, as was reported in El Monitor. And so this is a very complex system. You know, everybody comes to Abu Dhabi or to Doha those days. Just before Mohammed bin Salman came, Erdogan had just left, and very recently, Prime Minister Bennett from Israel came to the UAE. So there is a lot of elbow rubbing on the one hand, and great statements. All this in the framework of the difficult reappraisal of the GCPOA talks. So I believe this was, you know, important for not only for France, but for Europe, because France is going to be a president of the European Union starting January 1st, to reassess that the future of the region is absolutely quintessential to the developments of Europe because of migration, because of Islamism, political Islam, and what have you. And also because we're so interdependent over the Mediterranean. As I mentioned previously, to us, this is the Near East. For America, it is the Middle East. There's the Atlantic Ocean in front, in between. And the Biden administration clearly is not as interested in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as it was, and is more interested now into the South Pacific. Whether or not there will be a treaty organization, I don't know. But definitely the Europeans have to take things into their hands. And this was clearly something that Macron wanted to underline.
You mentioned that Macron's visit occurred just days before Sheikh Tahnoun visited Iran, and this is all happening during the JCPOA talks in Vienna. If you could get into a little more detail about the texture of the talks between Macron and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed about Iran. On the one hand, the UAE is on the front line of the Iranian threat, to the peninsula, thus the purchase of the French warplanes, the pending purchase of the American F-35s, but also the UAE is taking the lead in a regional diplomatic effort of engagement with Iran, or at least keeping a diplomatic channel open. We've written about this here at Monitor. The last time when the JCPOA was negotiated in 2015, there was not a regional dimension to the diplomacy. This time there is, and the UAE is in the center of it. What did you pick up about this change when you were in Dubai?
Well, there's a big challenge now underway in the whole peninsula, Arabian Peninsula, which is the challenge of the renewables. And the Gulf is in transition because these were countries that largely prospered out of fossil fuels, whether it be oil or gas. Now, after 2020 and the pandemic, a decision was made to prepare the transition to renewables, i.e. to invest into technology, whether they would use the uranium or atomic energy to produce green hydrogen, as the Emirates have decided to do, or whether they would go to solar and wind energy, as the NEOM project is supposedly aiming at. And this whole economic change, which is in progression in the region, together with Israel, also, the Abraham agreements were also the results of this sort of joint venture. I mean, Gulf capital plus startup nation technology to a large extent. All this, which will allow for the survival of the peninsula and of the states there, and of the social model for the future, is under Iranian threats. And everybody in the region remembers the attacks on the Saudi refineries of Homeis and Abqaiq in late 2019, which decreased Saudi exports from 5 million barrels a day for a few days until it was repaired. And that was under Trump, and the Trump administration wasn't present. And there was this close relationship between the Trump White House and Saudi Arabia at the time. So imagine the level of uncertainty and anxiety in the Gulf. So on the one hand, there is this sort of display of strength vis-a-vis Iran, and on the other hand, the peninsula oil doms and shale doms are trying to open diplomatic channels with Iran, because they feel that if Iran is squared and has nothing to lose, then it will resort to unconventional weapons. Proof was given in the past. So this is why I believe they engaged into this diplomatic exercise, and also because why they absent the US in the region, or semi-absent. They were keen to have the French president and also the future European president around, because it gave them some collateral within their complex process of negotiation and muscle showing with Iran.
Gilles, as you mentioned, when we started, Israeli Prime Minister Bennett is in the UAE as we're recording this podcast, and at Monitor, we've documented the tensions, friendly tensions, I would say, in U.S.-Israel relations over differences regarding Iran policy, although the U.S. is tilting a bit more toward pressure, at least in its negotiating posture. How do you see the Iran issue factoring into the discussions between UAE and Israeli leaders at this point? Is this a disappointment for Israel that the UAE has been so active in kind of regional diplomacy?
Well, if you allow me to try to use American colloquial, I would say it's a sort of bad cop, good cop relation, i.e., definitely Israel is the bad cop, is ready to hit, whereas the UAE tells the Iranians, listen, man, be reasonable and do not do things that would harm you. And in a way, every one of them is playing his own part. An Israeli attack on Iran would be retaliated from by the Iranians, along the sort of deterrence strategy that Iran has created. Iran has built this so-called Shiite crescent, as King Abdullah of Jordan said in 2004. Reaching out to Hezbollah and Hamas on the Mediterranean coast, so that in case it were attacked on its territory, it would then launch an array of missiles and rockets and what have you from southern Lebanon and from Gaza, as happened earlier this year, into Israel, and then cause a number of deaths and damage in Israel that the Iranians believe would be unbearable in America, and no American president could take that risk. And to some extent, they would also probably attack Gulf countries. And this is why the precedent of the bombings of the Saudi refineries of Abqaiq and Khurais is so present in the mind of our Gulfi partners. And the more deterrence capacity they have on their own, i.e., the French warplanes that they predate the F-35s, even though they are not going to be delivered tomorrow morning. Of course, it takes some time to build planes and to export them. Plus the drones that Mohammed bin Salman probably, plus the drones that Mohammed bin Zayed probably purchased, if I trust Al Monitor, in Turkey, are part and parcel of this counter-deterrence that the Arabian Peninsula countries are building against would-be Iranian deterrence.
You mentioned at the beginning that following President Macron's visit, there were other visitors coming to Doha. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. How did you find the mood in Doha? The embargo has been lifted. The Gulf states are coming together again. Are there still tensions with Qatar over the Muslim Brotherhood and other issues that had been the source of a grievance in the past, or do you find that the hatchet is pretty much buried and they're charting a new course in cooperation?
Well, the feeling in Doha was triumphant. I mean, they felt that they had overcome the embargo and the blockers because of their astute use of their wealth overseas and of their funds and their access not only to governments but also to major corporations, whether it be in America and in Europe. And of course, much talk of not officially, of course, but in the corridors and the lobbies of the way investment group in which the Qatar Investment Authority was present had bought 666 Fifth Avenue building from the Kushner family. And it was noticed that Jared Kushner, Mike Pompeo are still around in the Gulf those days after they left office. And so there was this feeling that, they had resisted. And that's one thing. And one consequence of that is that they do not need the brothers as much as they did in the past, because they are not in a situation of confrontation, at least with Saudi Arabia anymore. As of the brothers, I think they are not really upbeat those days. In Turkey, when someone like Mohammed bin Zayed comes with $10 billion, you can imagine that his nemesis, the Muslim Brothers, may be included in the bargaining. And the Egyptian Muslim Brothers have been told to tone down in Turkey. The Turkish Al Jazeera project is now sunk. And, watching Al Jazeera in Arabic those last days, the pro-brother line that was so prevalent and to some extent that had harmed Al Jazeera and its capacity to have a global outreach, because it was more and more perceived as the mouthpiece of the Brotherhood. This pro-brother line, as I could judge, has been toned down. So the brothers do not seem very relevant anymore politically in this issue. And my guess is that the Abraham agreements, to some extent, as they have started this sort of major transformation of the region from a region which was dependent, still has a lot of money because of oil and gas, but is thinking into the future, then no one wants to be kept out of it. And this is one of the reasons why I believe Qatar is eager to join the process and not to remain the nasty little duck, as we say in French. It sounds better, le vilain petit Qatar.
Gilles, the last stop on the visit was Jeddah, where President Macron met with Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. This was simply huge in that it's the first Western head of state to meet the Crown Prince since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Tell us about the tone of the discussion. There was the announcement of an initiative to deal with Lebanon. Be interested to hear how you see that playing out. And do you think there's any signal or a possibility of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords anytime soon?
I would not say so, because, they had Bahrain join, and Bahrain doesn't take significant foreign policy initiatives without consulting with Saudi Arabia. And Bahrain signed, and Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holy places. The third holy place of Islam is under Israeli control in Al-Quds Sharif, or Jerusalem. And I believe that such an initiative would probably alienate some support in the Muslim world if it were formalized. It so happens that actually the Crown Prince of Bahrain attended the luncheon with President Macron when there was this famous phone call with Najib Mikati, the Lebanese Prime Minister, and the Crown Prince signaled his interest in the French warplanes also, something also which was duly interpreted because it happened in Jeddah. I guess that what was most important in the conversation at first was that between the dialogue between the two heads of state was that Saudi Arabia is eager to develop its 2030 vision, which includes education, and access of a Saudi middle class, which in the past did not go train outside the country, and into this interest into developing this process of education. In the past, young Saudis were mostly educated in America and in Britain. There is a sort of lukewarm relation now, or cold relation between the present US administration and Saudi Arabia. And therefore, the European perspective is more important than ever for Saudi Arabia, even though, America still has an enormous amount of access that Europeans that do not have in Saudi Arabia. But as long as President Biden says he does not want to meet the Crown Prince, definitely the Crown Prince is looking elsewhere. So this was also an issue, and you mentioned, of course, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul. I was not privy to the talks, of course, between the two heads of state. Macron has already made a number of statements about that in the past. The issue, I believe, was now to consider that the success of development, social, economic, cultural development of Saudi Arabia is quintessential. We have to remember that Wahhabism, Salafism, and a number of things that led to the politicization of Islam went unchecked before 2015 in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is something that has changed significantly since 2017, and this cannot be without positive consequences in Europe. As of Lebanon, the initiative had been prepared discreetly ahead, and President Macron was keen to have the Crown Prince start up sort of new transfer of resources, investments in Lebanon, whether it be in the field of education, culture, health, energy. You know that Iran has replaced the other oil exporters in providing Lebanon and Syria with gasoline, sorry. And hence this was also something that partook into what you mentioned earlier on, i.e. that even the Saudis are keen to find a level of non-confrontation, of a Cold War, if we could go back to those days, with Iran instead of confrontation, and reinvesting some amount of money into Lebanon instead of dropping Lebanon because Hezbollah is in charge there, is part and parcel of this ongoing process of negotiations.
Gilles, last question. Your guest on your Al Monitor podcast, Reading the Middle East. Your guest this month is Emirati columnist and author and longtime Al Monitor contributor Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi, founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation and co-author and editor of the book Building Sharjah. And you did some field research in advance of the podcast in Sharjah. What can you share with us about the podcast without giving too much away?
Well, as I happened to be in Dubai a week before I went with President Macron, I mean, I've been more in Dubai in my this month than ever in my life, and Sharjah also once. Then I thought it would be interesting to do some, impromptu filming there. And so while we had this interview from remote with Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi to show some images of his art collection, and also of this sort of modernist architecture, which is now being replaced in Sharjah by a sort of post-modern architecture. And how this is a reflection on his on Sultan, from Sultan's point of view, on the way the attempts at building an Arab modernism, which was very much influenced by Iraq originally, with the independence of the Trucial states and other Gulf countries, became sort of engulfed, if I may say so, in American globalization, and what it led to, why it creates some adverse reactions now. And I believe that Sultan's action, both as an intellectual, as an art collector, also as a journalist, as an engaged intellectual, is extremely interesting, because it allows us to see below the glittering surface of the skyscrapers of the Emirates, and takes us back to what's in the minds of the Emirati population. And this is something that we do not really have access to that much. And so I was very, very glad that he accepted to come on our Reading the Middle East podcast, and that he was so convincing.
Gilles, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure having you join us again on the Middle East, and looking forward, as always, to your Al Monitor podcast, Reading the Middle East with Sultan Al-Qasimi.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be with you, Andrew.
We will return after this break.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you like this podcast and care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's other audio series, On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amberin Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts, along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Thanks to our guest today, Gilles Kepel, and our production team of Phil Calabro of Al Monitor and Beowulf Rockland of Two Squared Media Productions. We will be back next week, and if you haven't done so, please sign up for all three of our Al Monitor podcasts at your favorite podcast platform. First, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Kepel, and as we mentioned earlier, his guest this month is Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi, founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation and co-author and editor of the book, Building Sharjah. On Israel with Ben Caspit, his guest this week is Dr. Raz Zimet, an expert on Iran at the Institute for National Security Studies. And of course, this podcast, On the Middle East, hosted by Amberin Zaman and me, where I will be here next week with another decision maker or thought leader in the region. Thank you all for listening, and please keep up with all of the news and trends in the region at almonitor.com.